Our next speaker is Dr. Stephen Shoemaker. Dr. Shoemaker received his Bachelor of Science degree from the Citadel Military College of South Carolina and is a graduate of the Ohio State College of Veterinary Medicine as a Doctor of Veterinary Medicine. Steve has been involved with the United States Equestrian Federation drugs and medication programs for the last 14 years, and since 2006 has been the Chief Administrator of the Equine Drugs and Medication Programs of the United States Equestrian Foundation. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Ken. Thank you for having me this morning. Initially, when the Congress was announced it was being put on, I thought it would be interesting to attend, and then Graham Cook invited me to come and share our perspectives on equine drugs and medications policies as that they relate to non-steroidals. First of all, just to review our core philosophy, I don't think this diverts from anything anyone else has said in the last 2 days. Essentially, our two primary focuses are going to be the safety and well-being of the horses, as well as a balanced playing field. Obviously, minimize risk of long-term health considerations due to inappropriate short-term therapy, essentially long-term loss due to short-term gain. Discourage attempts to mask performance, limiting conditions, using medications, and obviously allow for the appropriate treatment when necessary. How do we do this? First of all, it's a 4-step program. First of all, we collect samples. We do this in a random process. And also, let me take a moment and say that when I got into this area, this field, and started working with drugs and medications with USCF, my understanding was that essentially every national federation had this kind of program in place and implemented this for their sport horses. And it was interesting to me to find out that that's not the case, that many federations don't operate their own program. But it's just an aside. So essentially we collect samples. It's important that we do this. We do roughly 25% of all competitions held in the United States, which are 2,500 to 2,600 a year. And we do this randomly, no advance notice. And you'll see later that by operating on a laboratory, this also helps to keep costs in line. Another component of the program, obviously, is we have the benefit or the ability to educate our members. We do this at competitions. We do this online. We also operate a 24-hour drug hotline, which people can call in if they have questions about medications potentially using in their horse and what the restrictions might be as far as competing goes. Operating 24 hours, it's sometimes not always, if someone's calling at 3 in the morning to ask about a substance in a horse that's not going to be competing for 4 months, I will say they may not be met with the same sort of exuberance as they would be at 10 a.m. in the morning during business hours, but we'll answer the questions. Obviously, it's a deterrence effect. By having our teams out and about at competitions, this provides a very visual deterrence to medicating horses, doping horses, and obviously medicating irresponsibly. I used to say that to John Lingle, which is my predecessor in the program, that I had done so much testing at so many different competitions that really didn't need to collect samples. He could just pay me to go show up at a competition and walk around. I put a little bag over my shoulder and go and see everybody, and people would recognize me, and they kind of start putting things away, or they do something in some disciplines, they pick up and go home. It's gotten much better, but the deterrence effect, I think, is the one that is probably least understood and probably the most significant of all of the concepts. Additionally, we also provide a public relations source to our membership who fund the program. Commonly, we're the only interaction they might have with our national federation at a competition, at a show. It's nice to provide them the feedback that we are doing something with their money. A little background about the program. We're in our 42nd year of implementing the program. Now we do, what's important or what's interesting about the 42 years is while we've been in existence, I was fortunate enough to inherit a program from Dr. John Lingle, who was the administrator for nearly 30 years. And I was fortunate to inherit two other individuals, one who will be celebrating her 30th year in the same role within the Equine Drugs and Medications program, who's been doing this for, it'll be 30 years in November. We had another one who celebrated her 21st year in April. So when someone calls that 24-hour hotline, they're getting one of two people with a combined experience of 50-plus years in answering drugs and medications questions, specifically for the sport horse. That's all we do. And I think it's an excellent service that we offer for our members. The program started in 1969 as a spot test program for the AHSA, stands for American Horse Shows Association. We test for 28 different breeds and disciplines. These include the 8 disciplines of the FEI. We additionally test for a variety of breeds, Morgans, standardbreds, or saddlebreds, sorry, Pasafinos, Arabians. We also operate our own laboratory, which is an FEI reference laboratory and has been since we've had it in existence. Came into existence in 1995 and completed the testing for the 1996 Olympic Games held in Atlanta, Georgia. And we also test for, besides ourselves and the FEI, we test for the American Quarter Horse Association, the AQHA. I'm sure you were aware of some of the polo incidents last year in Florida, where there were some horse deaths. Polo Association has put together a program where we assisted them in doing so, and now we test for the USPA, United States Polo Association, the American Endurance Ride Conference, National Snaffle Bit Association, National Rein Cow Horse Association, and a number of other associations and affiliations. It's important, again, to mention that we only do sport horses, so we look at it very, very differently. We're not looking at race horses. Our laboratory only analyzes samples that are sent in for sport horse competitions. And the other thing is that we're a complete program. Many laboratories, they provide the analysis for the samples that are sent to them. However, what we actually do is we go out, we'll collect the samples, we'll send them to the laboratory, have them analyzed, and then we actually process and adjudicate these positives through our own legal department, through our own legal counsel. Many federations, I think at this time, they may coordinate the effort to collect the samples and ship them off to a laboratory. Again, by maintaining our own laboratory, it allows us to focus on considerations that are specific to sport horses. Drugs that are specific to sport horses. They have a greater potential for abuse. Our laboratory is not dividing their time between two different athletic pursuits, regulating two different athletic pursuits. And I can understand some of the discussion yesterday where some of these laboratories, it would be more prohibitive to start quantifying non-steroidals because it's not something they do on an everyday basis. It's almost just shift gears, and it would be easier just to do it the same as they do every day. And that's what we do every day. It also enables us to keep our costs down, but I'll go into that in a few minutes. Currently, we utilize approximately 140 veterinarians across the country to collect samples. We collect them in Alaska and Hawaii, all 50 states. There have been some very notable veterinarians who have participated in the program as either a veterinarian or as we like to call them urine acquisition specialists. I mean, it's really a pea catcher, but it's easier to give them a title than a raise. So the urine acquisition specialist is some notable veterinarians. Harry Warner, a recent past president for the AAEP, when I met him a year or so ago, the first thing he wanted to talk about was his experience as a pea catcher in vet school. I'm sure you may be familiar with Dr. Dean Richardson, who was a veterinarian who took care of Barbaro following a post-race incident a number of years ago. He actually was a pea catcher or urine acquisition specialist for Dr. John Langle, my predecessor, when he was in veterinary school. We collect 14,000 to 17,000 samples a year, which represent 10 to 12,000 horses. Annual budget, and that may not seem like a lot compared to some racing laboratories, but again, only sport horses. One last thing I want to mention for Dermot's sake is actually our longest running testing veterinarian has done it 30 years this past June. So maybe got you by about 10 years. I don't call him our oldest, but our longest running testing veterinarian has been doing it for 30 years. Also, we have some of our urine acquisition specialists who are going to be coming out with a book soon that we may try and push. It's going to be called a low slow creep. And it really describes the science behind collecting a urine sample. It's not as simple as it looks, and sometimes it can be a dirty job. Our budget is roughly $4 million a year, and this is paid for or provided for through the per horse competition fees of all of our members. Initially, it was $1 per horse per competition. It went to $3 per horse per competition, then to $5 per horse per competition, and currently it's at $7 per horse per competition. And that was last raised in 2001. We just had a recent affiliate of the miniature horses, and so we've actually established a miniature horse testing team. So we'll be writing up the protocol for that in short order. That's the really low, slow creep. Okay. We're going to talk about horses competing under USDF drugs and medications rules. We're not going to deal as much with the performance effects. I think that was discussed at length yesterday and obviously clear to everyone. But I'm going to talk about what we find in the horse that's competing under our rules. Average number of starts per year is 20. This may take a while now. Average age of horses is 10. Average years of competition is 8.9. Is how long a horse under USDF rules will compete. Total number of starts in 2009, 1,717,352. Total number of deaths, 18. Only 6 were attributed to orthopedic cause. This is not something that we've actually looked at prior to or in advance of this Congress. It became interesting because visiting New Zealand for the ICRAF conference in March, it became apparent that the gold standard, or how racing jurisdictions were trying to compare themselves by safety of medication rules, track surfaces, was the number of deaths per start. So we went ahead and looked at this. Of the horses that were not included in the orthopedic consideration, those were colics. A horse may be found dead in the stall next morning, no obvious signs of a reason for death. Documented aneurysms, internal bleeds, and the occasional hit by car. So we had 1 or 2 of those last year. Horses got loose and didn't turn out very well. So when you look at this, our rate of fatal injury is 0.01 per 1,000 starts. When I started looking at this, I didn't understand why people a lot of times will refer to 1,000 starts. For us, this is the equivalent of 1 death per 100,000 starts. But it sounds even better the other way. As compared to racing, these are some statistics I got off the website and through the Jockey Club. In comparison, for racing in the U.S., average number of starts per year is 6.2. Really couldn't find an average age of horses racing. However, average lifetime starts was 20. And so if you estimate 3.2 years for the average career length based on 6.2 starts a year, 20 starts lifetime, works out to be about 3.2 years. Assuming that the racehorses start racing by 2 to 3 years of age, they're finished by 5 or 6 in the state. And that may be different than a number of other jurisdictions. And again, when you're talking about an average, you could have horses competing 7, 8, 9 years of age. We're trying to address the majority. Again, using this standard as far as number of starts And the rate of fatal injury is approximately 2, and that came off the equine injury database. I believe was recently presented. Some interesting statistics by Tim Parkin at the Welfare Summit. So it's around 2 fatal injuries per 1,000 starts. When extrapolated out, that was 890-some deaths for a quarter of the number of starts that sport horses had. And this may not be the best sole indicator of safety of a sport or of a discipline or athletic pursuit. There may be some other factors that need to be evaluated. As pointed out yesterday by Professor Hinchcliffe, you have to decide what questions you want to answer and how you're going to answer those specific questions. However, we use this number just to compare, considering, like I said, this is what's presented routinely. This is one thing that I think we're also going to follow up on, that we've realized that we have this database, we have this number of horses, sport horses solely, uniquely tailored to the information we need to compare to racing, or at least make prudent decisions about our own athletic pursuits, and not feel necessary to rely basically or solely on racing experience. So obviously we have older horses competing. We compete much more frequently. We have a longer competition life. We have a variety of athletic pursuits under the USCF umbrella. We have fewer restrictions on non-steroidals than racing. We have nearly 4 times the number of starts as compared to racing, but only 18 deaths. The comparison is that a horse was 189 times more likely to have a fatal injury racing in the U.S. than a horse that went into the show ring, the competition ring, or was competing as a sport horse. 189 times more likely with a more restrictive drug rule. When you compare those numbers, I think, and someone can correct me, but I believe in the UK it's around 0.7 per 1,000 starts, which would be for each 100,000 starts you'd expect 77 deaths. Again, that's 77 times higher than what sport horse incur with a least restrictive drug rule. I think ultimately, my opinion, and this may not have been in the literature, but my opinion is the major difference is not the drug rule between these two athletic pursuits, but the fact that race horses are competing at top speed. I mean, there's an inherent difference. This is not routinely done by sport horses. You know, obviously, if we're competing a horse that's on the average maybe twice as old as the race horse, we compete him almost 3 times as long, compete him more frequently, yeah, we have fewer problems. So that's the one distinguishing feature, and there may be other interesting work that needs to come out of this to try and distinguish the difference between the two pursuits. So our philosophy. Obviously, when we implement our drugs and medications rule, we recognize there's a fundamental difference between sport horses and race horses. I think we owe it to ourselves to recognize that. We do recognize the benefit use of judicious non-steroidal treatment. And I think the emphasis there is judicious. We don't believe that, as for the human athlete where it's unregulated, we don't believe that's in the best interest of the horse, and that's not in the best interest of the sport. However, we also think that completely withholding them, while it's a simpler and easier way to manage them, may not also be in the best interest of the horse. We recognize that we have an aging population of sport horses that are competing, and occasionally they may need non-steroidals. And we believe that our horses, believe that the welfare of horses is not put in jeopardy. And I think there was some information yesterday that needs to be looked into further, that potentially, if inflammation begets inflammation, there may be a role there in early intervention, and doesn't have to be a full therapeutic dose. And I'm just throwing that out there. I don't know. But I think it's something that needs to be looked into, because we had some discussion about the potential long-term benefits of nonsteroidals, judicious use of nonsteroidals. I want to reiterate, this is not a knock on racing. I don't do racing. I don't have any experience with racing. This is just, if we want to compare apples to apples, and we're going to use the same criteria, then we're going to use the same criteria that racing uses to compare their safety between different racing jurisdictions, tracks, and different conditions. It's more about identifying the risk for each individual athletic pursuit and addressing and tailoring drugs and medications rules to address those problems. And it's not always one size fits all. Additional thoughts. Ultimately, more permissive medication rules for NSAIDs most likely contribute to an increase in fatal injury in racehorses. We saw that just recently with Dr. Hillier just moments ago presenting that information, that in racing jurisdictions where they changed their phenylbutazone reporting level, they had a change in the fatal injury rate. I don't think there's any discussion or anyone that would disagree with that, quite frankly. But this is not the sole dominant reason that, that horses are having problems. There must be inherent risk when horses operate at top speed, which is not, again, reiterate, not common in the sport horse world. This concept is obviously supported by the fact that with our non-steroidal rule, our drugs and medications rule, are less restrictive than racing. However, it's been shown to have a dramatically reduced risk of injury. Just a few moments on the experience of quantitative restrictions. And again, as I said before, I can understand the reluctance of laboratories to have to break out of what they do every day and start a new field. And I don't think that's a product of the laboratory itself, but it's a product of testing under a racing mindset, which is appropriate for racing, absolutely appropriate for racing. But you're testing under that mindset and trying to apply it to a different, unique athlete, where, unfortunately, it does carry some more difficult concepts with it. We have nearly 20 years of experience of quantitating non-steroidals on a routine basis. That's what our lab does. That's a product of our lab. Our lab looks and deals with specific medications and problems in sport horses. Besides non-steroidals, glucocorticoids are a consideration such as are in racing. However, additionally, what's a huge area for our concern, or a huge concern for our group, is the use of human antipsychotics, sedative agents. Those are more specific, I believe, to sport horses than race horses. It's counterintuitive a lot of times that you would want to give something to a racehorse to slow it down. However, that sometimes is a goal, a performance-changing effect that people desire in FEI disciplines and the USCF disciplines. We implement this program. We obviously carry our own. We administer our own program. We also, with doing the AQHA, here's another organization that has 320,000 plus members, largest breed organization in the world, that has very, very similar non-steroidal policies. And we implement their program, and for a long time, we haven't had substantial issues with this. Equine Canada has also similar restrictions. And it's understood, I think it was mentioned yesterday by Dr. Rossier, that their experience is around 8 to 12%, if I'm correct, of the horses competing and tested, 8 to 12% had non-steroidal in their bloodstream. We've utilized this system very effectively. We estimate that it's about 12 to 15% of horses that we test have non-steroidals in their system at the time of competition, at the time of testing. I think there's a conception out there that it's the Wild West in the U.S. using non-steroidals. And just to draw attention to the paper that's been brought up a number of times in Kentucky, that was shown, it was published in 2008, but actually reflected 1995 and 1996 racing injuries as they related to phenylbutazone and flunixin levels. And I think what hasn't been pointed out was that being 15 years ago, at that time, the restrictions in racing weren't in place either, to the degree they are today. At that time, it's been, you know, I was told that they were permitted 2 grams of bute IV 4 hours out from racing. And that was what horses were allowed to have, and that's where the data came from. I don't think it's a fair representation of what happens today or the views that racing has today in the U.S. Ultimately, we have a violation rate of 0.4% with non-steroidals. So the fact that, and I can understand some concerns raised yesterday that if they're permitted, you know, it's kind of one of those things is, you know, if you're allowed to go 60 miles an hour, you're going to go 60 miles an hour. It's not that you back off and say 45 is more appropriate. The concern that if we're allowed to have a non-steroidal on our horse, then more people are going to use non-steroidals in the horse. And whether there's an economic basis, whether there's a welfare basis, or whether there's a placebo effect to the rider basis, you know, that may be a potential issue with initiating this kind of rule change. In closing, finally, I'm not a very expressive speaker, so I appreciate you bearing with me. I'm a simple veterinarian as opposed to quite a few of our colleagues here. Essentially, we believe we share the responsibility to our equine partners to recognize their uniqueness as equine athletes. We owe it to them. It's a responsibility that in USCF we don't take that lightly. There are hurdles to overcome to implementing a quantitative restrictions or implementing those restrictions in such as an international federation. From the laboratory to the education of stakeholders to the court of public opinion, you know, battling out and explaining to the media what the reason is for it. And obviously the various regulatory functions, setting the limits, adjudicating positives. There are definitely issues. There's something that, there are ones that we dealt with 20 years ago, and we have plodded on and feel pretty comfortable about our position. However, the concept of judicious non-steroidal use in the sport horse should not be abandoned because it might be challenging. I think we owe it to our equine partners to continue to explore it. And again, the first point is recognize their uniqueness. I agree that a joint is a joint, a foot is a foot. However, I think at the same time, what we ask them to do is definitely miles apart. There's some similarities, but they're miles apart. Otherwise, I would expect the frequency with which we compete horses to have a much higher fatality rate. This is the only discipline we do not regulate in the U.S. It would be more about ball bearings and grease and stuff, but what was interesting, and this was at a driving event, very fitting, but there is no steering wheel. She literally moves the golf cart by addressing the front 2 bikes. So I don't know if it's yee and haw, but thank you for listening today.